Good to see you. Did you go to Peru?
I did not go to Peru.
Okay.
I had my whole family and grandkids, but Adriana went, and Adriana Lopez from Argentina, and three of the students.
How'd it go?
Adriana says that it was great. I haven't really had a chance to debrief. You were there.
I know I don't ever get to go on that thing. It's just right over the time where we go for our New Year's. So.
Well, exactly. This year all my kids. So we did Christmas January 2nd, which is also my son's 33rd birthday. So we had a 33rd birthday for two granddaughters and our son's
I'm going to Vermont in a couple weeks. Yeah, sorry, I got you. So
well,
are you sure? I was actually going to do the same. Are you sure? Yeah, we used to. I usually walk around and there's usually a student. It's a good group. I really enjoyed the students. It's been nice having all the we have these two Tuesdays a month we're teaching this every month. No, but it's, I think it means it's
been a long day.
Good excuse.
Yeah.
Family.
I had a good conversation with her.
Oh yeah.
Challenging.
Very challenging. It's hard because she doesn't know how to turn it off. You know?
Yeah. Well, one thing I did tell her, and that Carolyn, UT, and our doors are open. She wants to. She has to call them there. I said, Carolyn, you can't talk to us now about the number. So basically, Carolyn's doors open. I just and vice versa. Yeah. So we had a problem like that once.
excited. I think there's some exciting and new things we're coming up. New courses. One on an outbreak investigation course, A&M, the Architect School. So it'll be fully collective, and then the leadership program that we're starting out. Leadership. It's a lot of work.
Field work rotation in Guatemala.
Oh wow.
So we've been doing one, or we're trying to do the ones that Carol's been going to we're going back to GHICC this year. Carolyn and Lori Brody and I. But the lady there just put me in contact with her. She has one at seminary. Take 12 weeks.
For 12 weeks, and again,
Yeah.
you know.
Now the first 7 weeks are after this year, it's very in a rotation.
Yeah.
Because the first 6 weeks she'll be forward, and then after that, it's like,
You know, at any point you guys want to go to PR or
yeah, it's really, and this is my opinion tomorrow.
yes, that's good. Already established.
I love
No new, no need for new.
hard to get the students away. Yeah, this year we're going to get like Thursday to Thursday or something. Because they want to squeeze it into orientation.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna move people around. Hello, everyone. I think. Is it okay if we start? Is that cool?
I'm looking for you. Yeah, I'm thinking, okay, I only know one person in this room, and she's not here.
All right, guys. Well, welcome back. It's good to see everybody back from break. I don't know if you guys have met Dr. Fingerhut. Dr. Fingerhut is an occupational therapist, world travel extraordinaire, and she is going to be leading the sessions, but I'm going to go ahead and lead the first one. We're going to kind of do it together. So this session is on public health epi and metrics. So this is I think like one of those, you guys went through global health, international development, you went through NGOs, you went through human rights, and this is kind of like one of those other big ideas in global health, which is public health. Most people equate global health and public health pretty closely. Like when they talk about global health, they're really, in many cases, talking about public health. So we're going to talk a little about how people in public health, anybody have like an MPH already or has done some public health work? Awesome. So you'll help teach us too. So there's kind of, it's just a different way of thinking than what we typically do in our health professions training. And so this module is really to start getting you thinking like a public health professional and thinking about some of the ways that we measure it. So it's been a long time. It's been like 6 weeks probably since you guys met. Did anybody bring an article to share? Anybody find anything on public health and your profession? Yeah.
I didn't bring it. I put it in online.
Awesome.
It was an article talking about Yemenis doctors who have stayed in Yemen throughout the whole civil war going on there right now. And how, there's just been this blockade that the Saudi Arabians and some U.S. troops have been participating in that have kind of kept any supplies from getting there. And about 2 weeks ago, they decided they were going to lift the blockade for about 30 days. But it was just talking about the stuff they've been going through in the midst of a cholera epidemic and everything they have to deal with that. Having little to no infrastructure to really figure out how bad this stuff is.
Absolutely. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. What else? Anybody else post an article? Yeah? We made eye contact, so. Anybody?
The article I found was talking about community health centers in Boston that were started like He the article was mostly advocating for like 20 DC, but it's kind of talking about the importance of health centers and working with impoverished communities that in the city. So just advocating for that too.
Great. So infrastructure and transport and the flow of goods is one part of public health. There's another part that's sort of the medical infrastructure and care facilities. What else? That's another hand. Yeah.
I mean, mine was really general, but it was just talking about how across the country, medical schools generally have started placing in the physicians who are on the initial boards have started placing a higher emphasis on having public health knowledge, both in the curriculum but also in on their entrance to these, because they think that is the thing that physicians need to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we've worked and trained you at the downstream for too long, right? So people are thinking that maybe it's time to start teaching you about upstream determinants and how to address all the stuff that helps keep people healthy in society. Good. Awesome. Anybody else want to share something? Yeah.
I found one where it was important to teach the general public the importance of physical activity. Because according to research, like more than a third of the population not in school.
Yeah.
It was about teaching them more than anything, and then they want to move from teaching to actually implementing the program.
That's awesome. Yeah, educating the population about healthy behaviors, absolutely. Very important for public health. Anybody from OT, PT, PA? Yeah.
For OT in Australia, they're trying to get more therapy out to rural areas. So just working with the health team there and just providing different specialty services for the district.
That's awesome. Yeah, and you know, disability really exposes the holes in public health infrastructure, right? And so that's quite good. Anything else?
As the newbie here, you've all talked about the International Classification of Functioning, and of course back in the I forgot the date, 86 or something, the whole paradigm shift from to health and wellness and disability mentality, and that I think shaped a lot of our change in curriculum and looking at, okay, how do we promote health and how do we promote participation as opposed to looking strictly at disease and cures.
All right. Excellent. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the public health approach. As I said before, this is like one of those other ways that people who work in global health are conceptualizing the world that we live in, that we work in, that we pray in, that we become healthy and stay sick in. We're going to go through a little bit of historical overview because I think for a number of reasons it's important to understand kind of the history of public health. This is not only an interesting part of life, but it gives you a little bit of perspective into kind of where we are on that timeline and where we're going and what the potentials are for as you develop your career. What we learned from the past can influence the future. Then we're gonna do it obviously in the context of some case studies, and as long as we have time, we'll be able to go through sort of a little bit of an outbreak simulation because that's really where modern public health comes to a boil, right? All of the public health skills that you're going to get throughout this session are really, you bring them to bear. That's like the emergency public health response, and where those things really become very apparent. So let's go to Fernando. Fernando's been through a lot in the last few years. He's now entering elementary school. He noticed that his parents noticed he's missing classes because of GI or respiratory illness, and that's really starting to affect his grades. You remember from the first case, his mother is a domestic worker. She works across town. She has to take several combis to get there. This is a combi. Has anybody ever ridden in one of these type of things? I see some nods. You can tell me. You haven't been on your international rotations yet, so I haven't forbidden you from riding in them yet. What was it like? Did it feel pretty safe?
It was like a roller coaster. It reminds me of like the rickshaws in India, except there's like 500 more people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how many people fit in these things? The answer to that is usually one more.
Yeah.
Yeah, not the best. So that's how she gets there, but it's also cost effective. And there it is. Meanwhile, Fernando's father was recently diagnosed with diabetes. We often think of countries as just these resource limited countries. They've just got all the infectious diseases, but they've got a lot of chronic disease as well. So he was diagnosed with diabetes, and he has a lot of hard time doing handiwork because of pain and numbness in his hands and feet. So does that make you think that his diabetes is well controlled or not so well controlled? Not so well controlled, right? So these are all things to think about as I ask you this question. In your groups, take about 4 or 5 minutes and just list 3 ways, knowing what I've told you about Children's GHICC. What are 3 ways that the Children's GHICC government could impact the health of its population? All right, 3 ways. You can list many of them, and we'll just keep going until we get through all of them. All right?
Learning to say that. Children.
There you go. Chile, Argentina.
I'm sure you made it up.
Oh, I totally. That was it. That was it. Children. Mexico.
No, we're just like all of we have so far.
No, we said like there.
Having like a and then we also said like in school having
I guess the same thing like a version of like your metro or something.
Just take 1 more minute. All right. So let's. Sorry. All right. Who's had the flu? God, isn't that crazy? No. This season. Speaking of public health.
I don't know if anybody read the news, actually are talking about this is shaping up to be one of the worst flu seasons in history.
Yeah.
Because
Yes, it is. In fact, in Galveston County is the epicenter.
no, it's
We are like an epicenter of the flu pandemic in Texas right now. Yeah. If you look at there was a recent the Galveston County Health Department are the number of cases that were reported in December to January are 8 times more than the same time last year, and several times more than like Houston or as terms of rates. So here we are. Welcome to the jungle. All right, so let's start with you guys. Let's give me 3. What can the government do?
Better transportation systems.
Okay, so transportation, can we put that into a bigger category?
we said
All right, infrastructure. Okay, so sorry about my handwriting. Transportation. Okay. What else?
Open up like a public health.
All right, so clinical care services. And what kind of services should those be?
Maybe like educational for different conditions that people have, or if they have any type of free care that they can give as far as preventative measures.
Okay, so preventive care, we'll unpack that in a second, or curative services. Good. What about you guys?
Okay. I guess sort of falling back under clinical services, but like subsidized insulin or other medications for those in need that can't afford it. Maybe there is an issue with, food deserts. If, he's still eating poorly and doesn't have access to good, healthy food choices, it may not be possible for him to control his diabetes well.
So what can the government do about fixing food deserts?
They can do lots of things. They can force it in stores. They can do food banks.
Okay.
And they can lower costs of building for tax rates for
Good.
grocery stores.
So as much as we hate to always admit it, there actually is a role for the state in encouraging investment, right? And so the state can do things like create incentives for places to do business, right? Now there's always trade-offs with that, but they can create opportunities. So good. So food banks, I heard that. Let's say market-friendly policies. Like that. Okay. Anything else? What about you guys?
Kind of covered them. We said education, medication, like providing a better pharmacy, and then they don't even have a pharmacy, but doctors adding a pharmacy there or something to provide medication.
So guaranteeing some kind of therapeutics, either government buys them or what else can they do? They can create incentives for pharmaceutical generics to be made locally, right? Okay. So that's thinking about the therapeutics. Good. And education, you said, what do you mean by education?
Education of healthy behaviors, because many people don't live lifestyles.
So how do we do that?
Talk to them about how to eat nutritious and exercise.
So you're saying clinicians can talk to people, right? It's like on the one level. How did you guys learn about being healthy? Who taught you? Your parents? Yeah, your parents taught you. I don't know. My parents taught me some healthy things and some not so healthy things. How did you make healthy choices in school?
I told you to cover your mouth. You were sneezing.
Yeah. Yeah. but there's school lunch programs and things like that. There's a lot of control that can be put into how people eat or don't eat, right? So education, and then I don't know, did everybody take health class, right? I mean, I did it. I mean, most of us in Texas public schools, right? I mean, we all have to do health class. It's mostly venereal disease, but when you get past venereal disease, it's also healthy eating and balanced diets and all that stuff. Good.
You should be in the schools,
Should- Yeah, Fernando can learn about it. Good. But community education, but also just literacy, increased literacy tends to lead to better health, right? What about you guys? Hard job.
We talked about a lot of those too. We had mentioned maintaining air and water quality, just to make sure random doesn't catch any bugs in the water or the air.
Actually, that's huge, right? So air and water quality. I mean, why do you think Fernando's getting sick? Why is he getting diarrheal disease and pneumonias and all these things?
Probably water quality.
Water, sanitation, hygiene practices, a lot of that. I mean, we talked about this in the first session. Magical things happen here, right? Like on Tuesday, I take the nastiest stuff from my house, I put it in a box in front of my house, and by Tuesday afternoon, it's gone, right? Now it's not gone. It goes somewhere, but it's no longer in a place where I'm going to get sick from it, right? So, and we have all of you to thank for that, right? We contribute to that as a society. We've determined that we don't want to live among our refuse, and so we put it somewhere where someone else can live among our refuse, right? So, so water quality, air quality, those things. You mentioned transportation infrastructure and clinical services, preventive care. When you say preventive care, what do you mean by that?
Health screenings.
Good. Health screenings. What else? Vaccines, right? The single most impactful thing you can do in many cases is purify the water, right? You know, dental health, like we fluorinate the water. That was a big argument, 40 years ago. That was the government, get the government out of my water. But now, I mean, many of you do not have cavities because someone made a decision that it was okay to put fluorine in the water, right? So all of these things are what we decide as society, and that is what the public health is, right? So, I meant to ask you this, right? So what is health? We've gone through that a while ago, but let's revisit it. What is health?
The ability to live your life to your fullest capacity.
Good. Okay. Yes. Break it down. I like that. It's a big umbrella.
I mean, health is kind of a big umbrella.
It's totally a big umbrella. What does it mean to be healthy? Are you healthy? Are you healthy? No? Oh, come on. I think you're healthy. What about you? Are you healthy? What?
like mental, social, and physical well-being.
Yeah. Yeah, you read the WHO definition. So a state of complete physical, social, and mental well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. So what does it mean? There's a couple words that I think are important here. One is complete, right? So is anybody healthy by this definition? No? You sure? You may be absent of disease or infirmity, but there are probably some days where you feel better than other days. Some days where, after those tests, maybe the mental health is struggling, and then after you hit the test and you go to the bar, you wake up the next morning, your physical well-being is not extremely good, and then that takes some time, and then you get sick, and so these are aspirational definitions, right? This is an aspirational definition, much like development is. It's aspirational, so it's what we strive towards, is health. And when we talk about a public health system, things that are guaranteed to keep you healthy, right? These are the things that you shouldn't have to make active choices about, right? These are, when we talk about the public health, or when we talk about public health as an idea, this is what we do collectively to assure the conditions in which people can be healthy. And as you guys listed here, you can see how many different systems have to cooperate in order to keep you healthy, right? Your infrastructure, roads and transport system, your health delivery system, your infrastructure water system, your environmental system, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Education. I mean, think about all of the different departments and systems that have to cooperate and come together in order to help you make the healthiest choices possible, right? And so when we talk about a public health system, it's not just about what you're seeing in the clinic. It's about all of those things that are taking place around you and in your society that either allow you to be healthy or take away your ability to be healthy, right? So it's about the choices that you can or cannot make.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Why is it that in this definition of health, the spiritual aspect is screened out? Because I know that man is made up of, is a three-bit person: body, soul, and spirit. And then, if you look at the soul itself, which is feeling, thinking, and other things that makes that component, which has to work with the body. Now, body has to do with the physical aspect of the body. So, what is the place of the spiritual aspect? Because one can be spiritually unhealthy, and then also it makes up part of you. Because if you separate this definition is like incorporate just only soul and the body, then screening out the spiritual aspect of it. So for it to be complete, there has to be a total consideration of spiritual, physical, and every other part of you. That makes you a whole person.
What do you guys think?
I agree. I did research at MD Anderson, and we technically put it under mental well-being. We actually did a study with caregivers and their spirituality, and the entire study was drawn from African Americans in faith-based organizations, and we pulled them, and then we did like caregiver burden studies on that population. So we classified it under mental, but like I would also like add like emotional and like spiritual to the definition to be more explicit.
Okay, if you classify it under mental, that one is mental is really placed under soul. Because I was trying to differentiate soul itself, because soul is made of three things. So then it comprises of how we feel, and then your will, which communicates what you want, and then the mind, which is what you think or how you think. So that comprises the soul aspect of it, which has to do with the other side of mental. And then the physical is the body itself, which when the body is bad, something is bad in the body. So the spiritual also has a role to play, which three of them goes together to make up a human being.
I think it's a very progressive thought, and it's interesting. There's only two of us OTs here, but the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework, which is our little framework of the domain of OT, is on version 3 or whatever, and spirituality was added in version 2. And so spirituality is now a complete domain within the practice framework that needs to be addressed with every client. So it update the dictionary.
Yes. And that's true. They do tend to classify spirituality and emotional health under mental. But you're right. You're right that, and part of that is that, the WHO in a way is not going to get into spirituality. It's going to leave that to individual communities, societies, countries to determine how it fits in to health. They don't want to be prescriptive about spirituality, right? But especially in our society, it's quite important. Well, it's important to some, it's less important to others, right? So very, very good points. I want to show a video. I keep forgetting to load the videos in advance. Please accept my apologies. I meant to do that. Oh boy. This is not my computer. Where do we go? This is one of these fancy Windows things. Let's see. What the heck is the internet? Where's the search bar?
In the big white bar.
That one. Oh, thank God. Thank you. Okay.
Public health?
Public health?
What do I think it means?
Good question.
I haven't a clue.
As against private health, you mean?
Hygiene? Hygiene.
Hygiene.
I don't know. I'm really excited about this sticker campaign. Everybody can see that we're actually doing things everywhere. So if people walk by, they can be like, oh, this is public health. Everything around you is public health. The stickers will be like our voices constantly reminding people that this is public health, this is public health, this is public health. By seeing these stickers, they'll see that we do a lot, and they'll see that they actually need public health to keep them healthy and to keep them well. Hybrid buses in New York provide cleaner air for everybody. Thank you. If there's a bike rack, that means that more people are actually going to be riding their bikes instead of taking cars or taxis. Let's definitely stick to that. Having a fresh fruit stand like this encourages people to include fruits and vegetables as part of their daily diet. We're sticking it so people can see that this huge cigarette isn't good for them. The message is clear. Water safety is a public health issue because if we don't protect our drinking water, then it can trickle down into the food that we serve. It's really helps people to pay a lot more attention to the nutrition and the things they're putting in their bodies. Public health right there. Community health vans are a public health intervention at a community level, making sure that the aging population not only has access to certain services, but has transportation to get there.
My definition of public health relates to the environment.
Public safety.
Eating well.
Free clinics.
Sewers.
Washing your hands.
It's teaching safe sex.
For AIDS awareness.
What's one thing that has a public issue is?
Maybe air quality. Truth in labeling.
I think it has to do with your eating habits.
Educating the public about ways to improve their health and happiness.
Helping people with cancer.
Being on constant monitor of your own body.
Taking care of the citizens of our city.
Public health is about controlling the factors that you can't control that control your health. You're only as healthy as the world around you. Public health is your health.
Public health is a red sticker everywhere.
I think you hit on most of those, if not all of them,
Yep.
in your discussions.
I agree with that. Okay. All right. Sorry I'm such a Luddite here. Okay. So, exactly. So, any thoughts there? I mean, think about it. Think about all the things that are around you that allowed you to be healthy today. You know, compared with 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, a century or a millennium ago, right? Or things that are active in other parts of the world, right? So all these things are about keeping you, your kids, and your communities all strong. Immunizations, screening programs, you've mentioned so many of those things, and the video really outlines all the various things that are in society that allow, I mean, including public safety. You know, the fact that generally people obey the stop signs. If they don't, then that's a problem for public health, right? So we put health, a lot of times we put health into economic terms, and it's a bit more impactful. We can, if we spend 10% more on public health spending, we can decrease infant deaths, we can decrease cardiovascular deaths, diabetes deaths, and cancer deaths significantly. There was a time where seatbelts were not mandatory. That was like an optional feature in the car, right? That was just, you had to ask for seatbelts and you had to pay extra for them. It was like a luxury feature, right? Now it's a requirement. And what has it done? It's reduced serious injuries and death in car crashes by 50%. This extends to kids too. Has anybody have kids? When you take kids out of the hospital, You have to show up with a car seat. You actually can't leave. They will keep them in the hospital until you present them physically with a car seat, right? That's a public health intervention, right? Because we know that kids are safer, especially infant kids are safer in car seats. So cigarette smoking, all of these things have profound economic impact. Plus, if we invest on public health on the front end, we save money on the back end, right? So it's estimated that you get about a 5-time return on investment for every dollar spent on preventive programming, things like these interventions that were described in the video, because it's always more expensive to treat something than to prevent it, isn't it? For vaccines, it's about a 16-time return on investment, right? Because it's really expensive. As we know, it's really expensive to treat vaccine preventable diseases in the hospital. And imagine someone who's getting measles, or someone who's getting diphtheria, whooping cough, right? These kids that are not vaccinated are coming in and they're having to get inpatient hospital care, sometimes ICU care. It's profoundly expensive. It's very cheap to do a vaccine. As Ben Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. He was a very smart man. That's why he's on the $100 bill. You don't get to be on the $100 bill by being a dummy. All right? So thinking about public health, thinking about health in this holistic way that we've talked about. Tell me some ways we can measure it. Some ways that we can measure health. Infant mortality rate. Congratulations. You guys are just about that. What else? Huh? Life expectancy. What else? Good. Prevalence of disease. I'm going to make you do incidence. Go ahead and start. All right. One more. Two more. Has to do with what the OTs do. So morbidity? Yes, it is morbidity. There's another way to describe it, which is called disability adjusted life expectancy. That's typically what we think of as morbidity. That's a hard one. But I have confidence that you will teach us about it. So take a few minutes, read these as a group, and we're going to go around and you guys are going to teach us about each of them, okay?
Okay, I'll buy you more bits.
Yes, please.
One thing we thought of one last year, so some of these mainly
the death rate and the number of survivors for each age or age group. Accordingly, life expectancy at birth is an output of data from vital registration, census, and surveys, case specific mortality required to compute life expectancy at birth. So we have to designate a spokesperson for larger groups and what is left out in the metrics that might be important to take into consideration.
The years of life lost basically responds to the number of genetics applied by the standard life expectancy.
Basically, all your business
social value weight, age, weighting,
so what do we do
original
left out?
study.
I think
World Health Organization updates social value weight calculated daily argument disability rate. These also include time discounting. More information.
Let's suppose that you're writing a
This part where it says its current estimated mortality rate is usually high. That's essentially dependent upon
What is left to happen?
it's dependent on the questions to the impact of number of deaths, life expectancy,
If
are kind of like the beginning of
you're just describing.
Oh, so they're taking data
Not like
years prior to
it's cool.
and they're looking at Okay, so that means that because the ending of the specified age range. Well, in terms of mortality rate, I mean, this is maybe the number died. Like I can skew the average to one thing that's unhealthy. Not proud of that. So I guess it's in mortality. That's where I'm looking at. I would have done it by a happiness kind of scale. Oh, that's cool. So it's wow. Study. I guess where you're asking is that the equality system this question was left out because I kind of went around the idea of maybe doesn't have to be maybe it could be more than so many elements, but that's so who was that? But the question is what is that city? But it's so it's so uncertain and as for number of grades, a couple like there's outliers based on gender, not like events happening. You all look at this where you live. Pretty much.
Guys, you want to take maybe 30 more seconds? See if we can understand. What do you not like?
It's like very specific to a very, very specific population. Life expectancy is going to be applied, like, even it has to be based on like your socioeconomic status, your social class, and what access you have. And it doesn't take into like it doesn't matter how long you live. It doesn't take into account the quality of your life.
In terms of like not being average or starvation.
I was
gonna say that yeah.
Huh? Oh no. I don't want to low. Thank you. I don't want to lowball. We just have to make sure everybody's on the same page. All right. Do you feel good, David? It's super. All right. So let's come together. Let's talk about. Let's hear from life expectancy. Let's start positively. Life expectancy. Tell us, what do you like about that indicator? What do you think is missing? What are some limitations?
So, life expectancy.
Go ahead and you stand up and boisterously project your knowledge.
So life expectancy is, I guess, a term that explains like the general mortality level across all populations, and it's based on different age groups: children, adolescents, adults, and elderly. And the definition is that it gives the average number of years that a newborn is expected to live with current mortality rates. The limitation about this metric is that it doesn't take into account like specific factors. Like it doesn't take into account whereas like factors that could affect your life expectancy if you were to live in a certain place, or if like there were other things that could affect like life expectancy, like wars or things specific to a certain population. So those are what.
That's great. So this is life expectancy at birth, right? So have you ever seen anybody calculate life expectancy? So you need something what's called a life table, right? So you in a population, basically what they used to do is say, okay, how many 1-month-olds do we have? How many 2-month-olds do we have? How many 3-month-olds? So on, then 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, all the way up the age spectrum. And then they would do that for about 5 years, and they would be able to calculate about how long, if you were born in that year, about how long you could be projected to live on average. So I completely agree with you. I think it amortizes things across an entire population. There are things that can affect that number that you can't really dig into it. Like if there's a war, if there's a famine, if there's a pandemic, right? If you look at life expectancy in Europe, for example, around the early 1900s, we get to 1917, 18, then 1919. Life expectancy just plummeted because we lost all of these young people to Spanish flu, right? World wars, those things profoundly affect life expectancies. They don't give you that granularity of information. They can tell you something big has happened, and they can tell. What's nice about them is that you can compare them across countries, right? Now, what they don't get at is the zip code, right? You know, in the United States, your life expectancy is determined by your zip code, right? So if you're looking at it as a country, we know that there are some parts of our country where people have a better life expectancy than others. Ethnicity, race, culture, you mentioned all those things, so that's really good. So it's one piece of the puzzle, but maybe not sufficient to say, oh, this is a healthy population or not. And you also mentioned quality, like if we're pushing life expectancy into the 80s and 90s, like are those good years? Are they crappy years? You know, are they years lived, you know, running marathons, or are they years lived with disability, right? So it doesn't really give us that granularity either. How about infant mortality?
So, mortality, actually, it's funny because the definition here, I mean, we all know it's basically just the number of deaths that occur for babies being born out of 1,000 live births. And it basically gets at how well a country's healthcare system may be, at least with handling the delivery of children. But at the same time, there are many. It doesn't take into consideration the health that comes after 11 months, because it only measures the deaths at ages 0 to 11 months. And for a country that, let's say, is high in hypertension or heart attacks, that's obviously not a healthy population. And infant mortality rate has no say in the majority of life. Even in children during the delicate years of like 6 or 7 years old, even that is not taken into account. So although it does a good job at measuring how well the healthcare delivery system is in a country, it does not take into account the lifestyle or any other parameter that determines the health of the population.
Yep, I agree. Any thoughts on that, Patricia?
I don't think so, but you nailed it.
Yeah, I agree. I think
well we deliver babies, healthy babies, but from then on, it doesn't describe health.
what does it take to keep a kid alive to its first birthday? Huh? A village. Yeah, definitely. It does.
Spoken like a grandmother.
Yeah.
A lot of energy. Oh man.
What does it take in the system? What's that?
Mental education.
Fantastic. Yeah.
It was just brought up. I mean, I know everyone always brings up, but the Finland baby boxes to try to prevent babies rolling and suffocating, and how parents continuously take the baby. The baby box probably costs $35 over. They'll give them, I think, a $100 as like a stipend if they wanted, and they never take the money. They always take the $80 that covers clothes, little hats and socks, and the box. So they do it the baby safe, and it gets them through that period of life.
Baby human beings are extremely fragile, right? When I lived in Botswana, we went on a safari, and I watched this. We had this whole parade of elephants that came through. Big elephants, big ones, small ones. There was this little tiny one sort of stumbling along, tripping over his trunk, and then, they come up to the river, and I was like, oh, we're gonna see the mama one pick it up and put it on her back with her big trunk and sort of Dumbo style, just take it across the river. No, she took it and just kicked it into the river. And then you sort of see this. I was like, should we go save it? And they said, no, it'll be all right. This little thing comes and a little trunk comes up, and then they get to the other side. I said, wow, that must be. If I did that to my kid, I'd be in big trouble, right? But how old is that one? 5 or 6? And that's a 1-month-old elephant. So 1-month-old baby humans are extremely delicate. 1-month-old baby elephants are built to last, right? So a lot of things take. So not just it's the delivery, and it's sort of that purpurium where they could roll over and they just don't know how to roll over the other way, and so they suffocate, right? There's there's vaccinations, clean water, breastfeeding practices. So it gives you a good proxy for general health education, health infrastructure, and are the kids dying? If you look at even at life tables for infant mortality, the peak is usually 2 weeks, because if they get neonatal sepsis, if they come out with some sort of other birth-related issue, it's usually going to rob them of life in the first 2 weeks, right? So so it's perinatal complications. So it gets at those sort of things. But you're right, it speaks to a little bit about preventive infrastructure, about how people deliver, but it doesn't really get at anything past that. So good. So these two together give us a little bit of a picture. What about you guys?
So we have compliments, and in general, it's a ratio of individuals who have been found to have a specific condition or disease in comparison to the total number of individuals with the population of interest. And point prevalence of specific is the same proportion, but comparing it on a specific day. And they use point prevalence to compare chronic conditions over a specific time period. And the one of the things that prevalence does not include is severity of condition. So within, let's say, within a population of 10,000, let's say 500 individuals have flu. You don't know if the majority of that 500 are faring much worse than other ones that aren't, for instance. And going along with severity, you also don't know the patient outcome. So how many of those individuals who have a specific condition are actually expiring or surviving? And also, it doesn't take into consideration population bias. So within the individuals that do have the condition, you don't know their age, you don't know their gender, and that definitely impacts your relative assessment of their current.
Yeah, so it's another important piece of the pie, right? Are those people living? What are they dying from? What is the prevalence of heart disease as people get older? What is the prevalence of flu? What are those things? That gives you another little picture. And as you said, it speaks to certain things, but it doesn't address all of them. And kind of to piggyback off of what you guys have both said, it also doesn't kind of give you an idea of whether those things result in any decrease in quality of life, or if they result in disability. Right? So are those causing people to be unhealthy, right? So as certain conditions go up, does that affect disability? Does it affect functioning? Does it affect their life expectancy? Prevalence gives you another sort of color to add to the rainbow of health indicators, but it in and of itself is not sufficient. And as you said, it's the number of people, it's exposure over the population at risk, right? So you wouldn't necessarily, like the prevalence of prostate cancer, you wouldn't put it in the United States. You'd put it in the U.S. men, right? Because women don't have prostates. So we don't necessarily include them in the denominator. We usually use prevalence with incidence, which is the new cases, right? How many new cases are there each year? How many new incidents are there? And so you can see, if I told you, for example, that in Botswana, that over a 10-year period of time, the incidence of HIV stayed stable, but the prevalence went down. Would you say that's a good thing, a bad thing? Or I'm sorry, the prevalence went up. Incidence stayed stable, but the prevalence went up. Would you say we're doing a good job or not a good job? What does that tell you? Yes, more people live, right? More people are alive. You don't get to be in the denominator if you die, right? And so if we can say that the same number of people over a larger population prevalence may go up because they're now staying in the denominator. Does that make sense? So, all right, good. I'm going to let Dr. Fingerhut explain dailies.
Oh no, Daniel's gonna do it.
We're going to let Daniel explain dailies, and then we can all learn about it.
So dailies are disability-adjusted life years. They're composed of two things. Well, first off, I'll just give a summary of them. Dailies, they kind of came up with the statistical term to be able to talk about how morbidity and how the effects of a disease, how that affects your life. So if you have diabetes, for example, you're going to have to worry about your insulin, and you're going to have to prick your finger, and you're going to have to follow a lot more than you would if you were healthy without diabetes. So we want a way to reflect that in statistics. So people came up with this. So it's an addition of two different numbers. The first one is pretty simple. It's years of life lost. So if you die before the life expectancy, say you died 82 in the US instead of 84, that's 2 years of life lost. So that's pretty simple. The part where it starts to get a lot more complicated is the years lost due to disability. So the way that they construct this, if I remember my epidemiology class correctly, they'll basically go to populations who have the disease and they'll ask, what's your quality of life? So they might say, on a scale of 0 to 100, what's your quality of life living with this disease? And they might say, oh, 80% or something like that. It's not 100%. I don't feel 100% healthy. So because of that, they'll be able to say, all right, so for every year that you live with this disability, you get 0.8 instead of 1. And so then they kind of add that up, and it's like, okay, so every year that you live with diabetes is like living 0.8 of a year instead of 1 of a year. And so then you can start to kind of quantify, okay, how much does this disease impact the population? What's the morbidity of it? So you might have some diseases, for example, a whole class called neglected tropical diseases, which they have a high morbidity, so they really lower people's lifestyle and the way they live, but they don't usually kill people. And so neglected tropical diseases, we might want to tackle those, so we'll talk about dailies as a way to quantify that. Now there's a big downside to these in that the way we construct how much that value of life is completely socially based. So we're just going and asking people. So if you live in the US, for example, and you're wheelchair bound, we have ADA regulations where you can go into any building if you're in a wheelchair, like that's fine. But if you live in Iraq, that doesn't exist for you. So you're in a much worse situation if you're wheelchair bound in Iraq. And so then there's the whole question of how does society respond to your disease? So maybe it's easier to live with diabetes in the U.S. and maybe it carries a social stigma somewhere else. There's all sorts of other factors that make it a little bit fuzzier than the clear, distinct border looks at first once you start to zoom in.
I'm going to record that and just use it.
I was going to say you did a heck of a lot better job than I would have done.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. And there's this group called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. It's based out of University of Washington. You can go to their website. They write this report every few years called the Global Burden of Disease. So if you ever hear someone talking about the burden of disease, they're talking about disability. They're talking about dailies. And what they're trying to do is improve the metric, right? Because, as was mentioned, the issue is that, depression may carry a much greater stigma and may result in much more disability in one country versus another country. you can look, when you look at dailies, for example, back pain, chronic low back pain, has a huge amount of disability, but it doesn't kill you, right? And so it gives you a little bit of granularity about the morbidity, right? So this can result in a lot of dailies, but not a lot of death. So it gives you that bit, and the data are getting better, but still, there are countries, I mean, especially, war-ravaged countries, it's going to be very hard to survey people and figure out, well, in your setting, you have to rely a lot on national statistics, national reports. Sometimes they're reliable, and sometimes they're using a lot of sort of statistical manipulation. The methods section on the IHME, on the Global Burden of Disease study, is like 150 pages long. So just people do think about this. But great job. Anything to add on that?
I don't think so. We were, again, talking about participation and the fact that, you may use a wheelchair for your mobility or glasses for your vision. But if you are able to do everything, all the occupations in the day you want to do, then you're not disabled.
Exactly. And it also, one of the other limitations to that metric is if you go blind in your 50s, it's actually quite a bit more disability than if you go blind and you're young, right? But the metric doesn't really, because when you're young, you learn how to deal with it. When you're 50, it's much harder to teach that old dog the tricks, right? So it also doesn't get at when things happen, right? It just goes at a disease or a condition from an overall perspective. Good? Feel better about metrics? Okay, check mark. All right. Come on, baby. I got the circle of death. Did I wait too long? Did I make you angry? Okay. So I'm going to spend about 5-10 minutes just going through how we got to because that's very sophisticated. I mean, think about that. There is like a group of people whose job it is. Like I looked on their website. They have job positions open for statisticians and epidemiologists to work for them and help them crunch numbers on health in populations, right? But we weren't always that sophisticated. We used to be less sophisticated. There was a time, really from the BC times, really to the early 300s, 400s, where we really believed in this idea of humors, right? That most medical problems, most health problems were an imbalance of things. If you had too much air, you needed to get a little bit of earth. If you had too much water, you had to put some fire on it. And most of the interventions were really targeted at restoring balance. And many traditional forms of healing still use this type of methodology, this type of thinking. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong, but we didn't have a lot of sophisticated ways to measure it. So usually and Hippocrates, who's often called the father of medicine, the first to really outline diseases and conditions and healing people as a profession, even subscribed to this. And usually it was some form of, bloodletting or, inducing vomiting or causing fever or chilling people down. And you would do these things to try to cure them of whatever ailed them. Fast forwarding to about the 1300s, something started to happen in East Asia and in India, so mostly in the former Orient, right? So the healers of those communities noticed that people who were exposed to smallpox, which is killing everybody, like smallpox was like the death sentence in your community. If you got smallpox, it was like, there was not a whole lot of possibility of you surviving. You might make it, you might not. What they found was that in communities where people had been exposed to the pustules of smallpox, sometimes they got pustules or they got a group of them, but then they resolved and then they didn't get sick. So they thought something must be in those things that helps people stay well. So what these Chinese healers started to do was to extract the substance inside the pustule, dry it out, grind it up, and then they would blow it into the nose or infuse it under the skin of people in order to protect them. And what they found was that some people And they would try to do it with people who had a milder form, because they said, well, if you had a milder form, you get a little bit of the milder form, and then you're not going to get as sick. Certainly some people got the full-blown smallpox, but they actually started to notice that when they did this to people, they were able to start protecting them from smallpox. So it was the first time, really from the time of humors and bloodletting, that anybody was thinking about not just dealing with a problem when it showed up, but trying to take care of a problem before it actually happened. There was this theory of miasma that sort of emerged out of humors as we started to say, oh, well, maybe there's something in the air. Really, a lot of disease was thought to, people started to notice, especially people taking care of the sick, started to notice, well, people with this coughing disease, they're kind of all in the same place. And people with diarrhea all tend to be in the same place. And people who are obese or who have lifestyle problems tend to be in the same place. There must be something in the air. Right? They called them miasmas. This picture is actually of these are the people fighting the cholera outbreak, which was thought to be from the bad air of those poor areas in England. Right? So miasma theory actually it lasted it had good staying power. It lasted well into the 1800s. Even as we were discovering other things that were disproving it, it really had a lot of roots. In about the 1600s, this guy, who you can't see his name, but his name is Antony von Leeuwenhoek. This guy was a draper, right? He made drapes. Right? And you think, man, from humble beginnings came science. So this guy was a draper. He made drapes. And this guy he was sort of an obsessive. He wanted to make the finest drapes. And he wanted to make sure that his thread counts were perfect. So he started developing lenses so that he could examine the threads. But what he noticed as he started to make these lenses was that he could see other stuff too, right? And his initial lenses could get like up to 200x. So he was really looking, but he started looking at other stuff, and he was like, he looked at skin, he looked at spit, he looked at feces, he looked at sperm, he looked at everything, dirt, and he started to see all of these other things, this whole other world, this whole other life beneath these lenses. And he called them animalcules, right? Animalcules. And actually, this guy was so obsessive. He was also very protective. So he shared some things, but he hoarded a lot of his pictures. And he drew pictures he has like 200 or 300 pictures that he drew painstakingly of these things. And he started to design lenses that got smaller and smaller. And he designed the first microscopes. And this is what the first microscopes looked like, where you put whatever sample it was, you'd hold it up to the light, and you could, with the refraction, you could actually see whatever it was that was on there. So put your sample there, and he just drew everything. He's actually credited with outlining the first protozoa, with spermatozoa, all of these things. I don't want to ask him how he got those samples, but he got all of them, and he was able to look at them and draw them. Oh man, blame tomorrow. Don't bother me, stupid Microsoft. This is what I use for many reasons. Okay. So we had miasma theory. We were starting to outline germs. These animalcules started to be defined as germs. But what you'll find throughout like public health and medical history is that we didn't always, therapeutics tend to lag behind our knowledge of science, right? Even now, all the stuff that we do, the things we prescribe are very blunt instruments compared to what we know about the pathophysiology of disease. Wouldn't you agree? Like you guys know all these genetic things, you have to memorize all of these cell cycles, and it's like, well, at the end of the day, I'm just going to give you this one thing that's going to wipe out your bone marrow, right? We just haven't developed the therapeutics. And that's no different than back in the 17, 18, 1900s where this is pyretic saline. It was sort of the cure-all for everything. Even William Osler, who was called the father of American medicine, actually a Canadian guy, right? William Osler, if you read his textbook, there's no antibiotics, right? Those weren't invented to the 1930s, right? So everything is mostly he prescribed a lot of opium, right, and fresh air, and pyretic saline and these kind of things because that's what we had. So the giant leaps came in the late 1700s, early 1800s, where Edward Jenner, does anybody know the story of Edward Jenner? So Edward Jenner was the one who discovered he was the first one to develop a vaccine for smallpox. So Edward Jenner had had noticed, just like a lot of the scientists of his time, he was in Britain and he noticed that there were these milk maidens that would get exposed to cowpox, and they would get like a little rash. And what they noticed, everybody knew that the milk maidens didn't get smallpox. It was like their superpower. And he said, there's something more to this. So he started examining them and said, well, they got cowpox. Maybe the cowpox, which was a similar rash to the smallpox, but not nearly as deadly, maybe this helps them. So with this theory, like armed with that theory, he convinced his gardener to let him experiment on his gardener's 8-year-old son, right? This was before IRBs and all those things, ethics. But he said, I'm so convinced. Let me give him, let me inoculate him with cowpox, and then let's just see how he does. So they inoculated him with cowpox, got a little rash. He did fine, and then Jenner injected him with smallpox, and he was fine, right? And they said, okay, it works, right? N of 1, it works. So they started doing bigger studies, and they found that when he injected cowpox to people, instead of having to variolate them, expose them to the actual smallpox, he could give them something like smallpox, but not smallpox. And that just opened the door. And that's why, so cowpox, so cow is vac, right, in Latin. So vaccination instead of variolation. Right? So vaccination really comes from the cowpox vaccine that was Edward Jenner developed. And this really escalated. We started to see that, as people who are concerned about populations, we could do something to prevent the disease. And that was the beginning of the end of the smallpox. Same happened with the Salk and the Sabin vaccines. The Salk vaccine was 1953. That was the injectable polio vaccine, a poliomyelitis, a disruptive, profoundly disabling neuropathy, neuropathic virus. Changed lives. The Sabin vaccine in 1961, which is the oral vaccine, they found out ways to sort of expose people to these things. As we learn more about the germs that cause them, they could study them, expose people to them, and prevent the disease. Anybody know who Jon Snow is? And no, I don't mean the guy from the Game of Thrones. Father of epidemiology. So I apologize in advance because this video has appearance by Dr. Oz. It is not an endorsement of his knowledge, but I like the video because it tells the story of Jon Snow. Oh, I muted you. Sorry, man. I'm doing so bad with technology today. Sorry, guys. Okay.
London in the 1850s is a marvelous jewel of a city. It's also 2.5 million people crammed in a small city with no infrastructure. You had no big sewage system at that point. You had no waste management systems. So think about what would happen if you had a disease like cholera, which requires sewage and clean water mixed together. The bacteria moves from the human body, but it can only survive if it gets into the water supply and it's transmitted through feces making contact with water. In London, you have a situation where no one knows why this disease is spreading. In 1854, when there was this outbreak around the Broad Street pump, within a week or so, over 500 people died. 3/4 of the community had fled, and so this was a very severe outbreak.
Cholera is this plague that ravaged through Western society that everyone ran from. Jon Snow was a risk taker. He was willing to put his life and his career at risk by going into places where there was cholera.
Jon Snow was one of the first epidemiologists, and what he decided to do was, using the scientific method, try to figure out what was causing cholera in the community. Jon Snow begins to construct a map, and he finds that the disease tracked with the map of the water supply of the city. supplied with similar sources of water were being affected. And the neighboring area, which didn't have the same source of water, were not being affected. You could track back this map, and the map looks like a star, and the star has a center, and the center is typically, was in this case, typically a water well, or a common water supply source. And thereby, he began to figure out that it must have been the water supply source that was causing this epidemic.
Look, it's the water that's making people sick.
John Snow convinced the local board of health to take the handle off the Broad Street pump and then bring that outbreak to a halt. And we continue to use all of these epidemiologic methods today.
Like piecing together those clues of a detective, using information and science, he changed the course of infectious disease in the Western world.
Science. So that's the real Jon Snow, guys. So did you notice how they were all running from the miasmas with their handkerchiefs over their mouths, right? So this was a guy, so that like mapping, yeah, we use fancy GIS now, geospatial imaging, but we're still using maps, right? In the same way that these guys started using 170 years ago. So when I think about public health and the history of public health, and I'm going to just leave us dim right now because I have another video, I like to think of sort of throughout history the things that have shown us where public health has had a negative impact and where public health has actually helped us do amazing things, where the knowledge of public health has actually been, let me not say weaponized intentionally, but has been weaponized. So the best example of that is Haiti. So Haiti, prior to the Spanish arrival in the 15th century, was an island. So Haiti was on the island of Hispaniola. Hispaniola is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right? It's in the Caribbean. And there was a native population there, about 400,000 before the Spanish arrived. But 200 years later, not a single native person to that island had survived. The European colonial powers had brought their diseases. They brought smallpox, TB, and measles. Whereas there was a consistent supply of those people, there was not a consistent supply of the other. And those populations, those native populations, were completely unexposed to these pathogens, and so suffered greatly from them. Certainly, tropical diseases affected the colonizers. They could always replace colonizers, right? So as local populations, which would have been sort of the fountain of a resistance, were really decimated by infectious disease, really the Europeans were able to take over, import other populations, and make Haiti a big port for the slave trade. And certainly that has changed throughout history. It's no longer a port for slave trade, but the social and economic consequences of this importation of disease and the effects that it had on an unexposed population had profound social and economic consequences that affect world health today. Today, Haiti remains the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere and the one with the worst health outcomes, right? Despite years and years of economic aid. You guys kind of addressed that a little bit in your international aid section. Compare that sort of public health fail with a public health win, right? And that's the Panama Canal. This is where, as Dr. Oz said, we use the power of science to do really something pretty amazing. So remember in 1880, we were just understanding that not everything was transmitted in the air. We were starting to understand that there were germs associated with different types of infections. Osler had written the first version of his textbook, which was documenting, tuberculosis and typhoid fever and all of these different things. Viruses were starting to be discovered, but we didn't know how they were moving and how they were transmitting in the population. So there's this audacious idea that in order to move goods and services from east to west, right, from eastern to western hemisphere, you tended to have to pass, if you wanted to go around South America, you had to go through the Straits of Magellan, which are around the tip of South America, and that is treacherous waters. Those waters are littered with the corpses and the carcasses of many, many ships that just didn't make it. And it was months and months. And so because we were in an era where you could have those conversations, they said, there's this little tiny piece of Panama. Wouldn't it be nice if we just cut a hole in it and just so our ships could go through? Like, imagine trying to have that conversation now about anything in geopolitics. Not possible. Back in the 1800s, totally possible. And so, so they said we can cut a hole in Panama. We can put the ships through, save months. People will do well. And so the French said, we'll do it. 1880, they start construction. 20,000, within the first few years, they lose 20,000 workers. They just can't keep it up. They're all dying from malaria, yellow fever. In 1881, in Cuba, they identify mosquitoes as the vector that carries those pathogens. And the French said, jamais, we don't want to do it anymore. So in 1904, U.S. took over construction. America, right? America first. So U.S. took over construction, and what did they do? Instead of sort of waiting for things to happen, they thought upstream, they thought preventively, they thought about public health. They said, we know the mosquitoes cause this, so we'll drain the swamps, we'll divert the water supply, all the workers are going to get bed nets, they're all going to get quinine, because we think that people who have quinine are not getting this disease. And in 10 years, they were able to finish construction. And I obsess a little on this because I think that it is just magical. I think it's a magical thing. Has anybody ever been to Panama?
Put it on your bucket list.
Yeah.
It's been called one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. A man-made waterway, 50 miles long, that forever altered the face of the earth.
The Panama Canal exceeded any country's capacity. If in 1904 you asked me to put money, I would have said, no, it cannot be built. Nobody knew how this was going to be done.
The geographic location of Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, has always been coveted as a way of making the oceans meet. With the building of the Panama Canal, the realization of a dream became an expression of the power, the strength, the might of a growing nation.
For nearly 100 years, the Panama Canal has stood for the triumph of technology over nature. But when it was built at the dawn of the 20th century, it was simply an audacious gamble, a colossal engineering project, the likes of which the world had never seen.
It's a story of inspiration. It's a story of humanity. What man can endure with the pick and shovel to dig the canal.
It used science and engineering and government to improve the country and really improve the world. But it has a dark side as well. It is also a symbol of arrogance, authority, and power.
The canal really announced the United States as the leading country in the world. It demonstrated an extraordinary will and determination. They had succeeded in conquering nature as no one had ever done before.
Public health win, all right? Never would have been possible if we didn't understand all of these things, if we didn't learn from previous experience and actually address the public health issues. And what that did was showed us that actually, Hugo, do you mind turning on the light? There's this better. Does it matter? Lights are good. So it showed us that doing things like vector control could actually control disease spread in population. These are a picture of the bed nets that were not only given to those who fell ill, but those that wanted to prevent illness. So, and this was also a sick bay. So this was where they were keeping those that they knew were infected separated and protected from others. This is them dredging and spraying. You can see this little canister here. They're spraying insecticides. You remember the first activity we did when we talked about the tsetse fly, right? Same thing. We were figuring out that doing all of these things together could help us do things. This down here is another big public health intervention as we learned pathogens and we learned how they were spread and we learned that there were vectors and we could control them, but that humans often were the vectors. You know, next time your patients don't want to get a flu shot, well, refer them to the 2018, 2017 flu outbreak, but also the 1919 Spanish flu outbreak, right, which was one of the most devastating flu outbreaks in human history. This was a quarantine center for people who were arriving to the United States in New York City. This is a leper colony, so we quarantined people with leprosy because we didn't understand how it was being transmitted. We knew if we kept them separate, generally we could reduce the transmission of leprosy. We thought it was because of contact with all of the sort of the rotten extremities, but in fact it was a respiratory disease, as we found out later. And as we started learning and figuring out that we could control diseases in populations, there started to be much more communication about that internationally. So the very beginnings of international diplomacy around health were focused on infectious diseases. Now, that has a little bit of a sort of tale associated with it because it was initially because of protection of colonial interests, as we talked about in the first session. It was about, well, how do we prevent these diseases from coming from the deep, dark South to the colonial North? But it started to be much more, as we moved through the 1800s and then into the 1900s, it was about coordination. We were becoming increasingly mobile. We had established the Panama Canal. Populations were free to move around the world, and we needed to start understanding how diseases were emerging in some parts of the world and finding their ways to other parts of the world as we, as human beings, as animals, started to migrate, right? And as you saw in the early 1900s, the International Sanitary Bureau actually was the initial organization for coordination of health policy across the Americas, and that eventually became the Pan American Health Organization. The other things we learned is that education was important, that we had to educate populations about how to prevent disease. We knew that tuberculosis was caused by respiratory secretions. We knew that certain diseases, I mean, you wouldn't know how many great artists and politicians died of venereal disease because we didn't know that those things were transmitted by sexual contact. And then we started to advertise and get knowledge out there, and then there it is. We started to prevent those diseases from causing problems. This seems like whenever I show these, people kind of laugh at them, but this was completely novel. It's now ingrained in you. You know all of these things. You know what to do and what not to do. But a lot of that is built on the legacy of public health. And this is where we get to now. This is modern public health. It's not all curative stuff. It's not even all vaccinations. It's data. It's information. And it's using that information to generate policy and to generate interventions that you then measure and then just determine whether they worked and then modify them. And it's all centered on research and the systems that it takes to do that. So they call the public health, the APHA calls these the three core functions, which are assessment, policy development, and assurance, and then the 10 essential services, which include monitoring, diagnosing, and investigating, informing, educating, empowering, community partnerships, developing policies, enforcing laws, linking to care, assuring a workforce that's competent, and then evaluating. And just it keeps going. And that's how we keep the public health improving throughout the world. Okay? So I want to show you one last video before we go on to our last activity. And this is a video from the CDC. It's a few years old. I like it because I think that what I want you to do is, as I show this video, we're going to come back to this, and I want you to watch this video and think about this wheel. Think about this process, all right, of public health, and tell me what you saw in the video. This is a CDC video about some of their activities in Kibera, which is the largest slum in sub-Saharan Africa. Hugo, you might. Oh, thanks, man.
it's actually very hard to imagine that there are people in the second decade of the 21st century that are living under these conditions. One of the other things you notice as you walk around in Kibera is that the people that are there are almost always smiling. They're within the moment and accepting the condition that they're in and doing the best they can to live well within those conditions.
In Kibera, I think I'm okay because I'm getting my day-to-day bread, so I'm fine.
Kibera is the largest continuous slum in Africa, and we have somewhere between 600,000 and 1.2 million people living in basically a river of informal huts and structures. We have a very unique project going on in Kibera. The point of the work is to understand what diseases are causing the most problems for the people living in this environment. And so the way we do this is we have a group of what we call community interviewers. They're basically field workers. Most of them actually come from Kibera. They're residents of Kibera.
We have a total of 25 field staff who go around into the villages collecting household mobility surveillance.
And they carry personal digital assistants, PDAs. And they go to, and these PDAs are programmed with the questions that we're trying to get answers for.
Like, we can talk of cholera. H1N1 was found in the community. Through the community interviewers visiting the households, the questionnaires they asked. You can come to our house every week. You wanted to know how we are going on. Anybody has been sick, anybody has been in hospital, 2 weeks, maybe.
And we're about to go into a home where one of our community interviewers will be collecting data about illnesses in the home.
So in this last 1 week, when you say next week,
this is an area of about 30,000 people, about 8,000 households. They go to every single household every 2 weeks, and they collect information about who's sick in the household and what kind of illness they have. And if someone's very sick, they encourage them to go to the field clinic. It's right smack in the middle of the surveillance area. And so everyone in our surveillance area, the 30,000 people that we do surveillance on, lives within, no more than a kilometer, much closer to this clinic.
Like when they infected with pneumonia, couldn't walk, I couldn't do anything. So my neighbors carried me up to CTC.
When they go to that clinic, if they have a condition that we're surveying for, that we're concerned about, let's say it's pneumonia as an example, then we collect information about that illness in the clinic by one of the well-trained clinicians that we have working there.
We have identified quite a number of bugs. Initially, diseases like flu were not considered to affect third world countries, especially in Africa.
And now we're preparing over the next couple of months to introduce influenza vaccine in the population that we're working in. The way we conduct our surveillance, we can extrapolate to much larger populations and therefore influence policy that is not just limited to the population that we're doing the work in. Being able to identify that we have huge incidence rates of typhoid fever, for instance, enables us to go back to the ministry and say, if you use typhoid vaccine in similar environments, you can prevent a certain number of these severe infections per year at a certain cost. It's clear that, like it or not, we live in a global village these days, and because of market practices, because of air traffic, it's very possible for disease to move from one corner of the earth to another within a day. And so diseases that emerge, for instance, in the urban slum of Kenya that might seem so remote and not relevant to someone living in North America are actually quite relevant and quite important. There is progress that will be made, and we have tools now that we can bring to bear that will make a difference. It is somewhat helpful to know that there are people, there are organizations, there are governments that are willing to focus on these problems.
There's nothing that motivates me much as seeing somebody or a child who was sick getting back on its feet again. They are positive. especially the women and children, because they know what they're getting from CDC.
So it's a bit of a CDC promo, but what were your thoughts looking at this? What did you see?
A willingness to like accept the fact that we exist in a global community, whether and what that looks like for us from a health perspective.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. That it's sort of it's those concepts that we started to see when I talked to you about the Pan American Sanitary Conferences. That diseases can just hop on a boat, hop on a plane, we're interconnected. Good. What else did you see? What did you see as far as this? What is now considered this is public health? Right? Sure, slapping the stickers on everything is public health. This is public health. What did you see? See any examples of this stuff? Did you see any monitoring of health? How?
They're going every 2 weeks to their houses and just seeing how they're doing.
Exactly. They were going with, again, this is a little old, they had PDAs, right? They'd be using smartphones now, right? Which they are. But yeah, they go every 2 weeks, they're monitoring this health, they're seeing if there are any changes. When there are changes, what do? They diagnose and investigate, they refer to the health center. They're doing information and education, empowerment of the community. They talked about partnerships within the community, right? That CDC was working alongside local partners, governments, community organizations to develop policies. Remember we talked about typhoid, talked about flu vaccine. What do you do without data? You don't have anything. Because you can go in there and say, hey man, everybody's got a cough. I think we need more flu vaccine. They say, do you know it's flu? You say, I think it's flu. I have a pretty good suspicion it's flu. Say, well, have you studied it? No. Go back in your circle, right? Monitor, diagnose, develop policies. Then engage the Ministry of Health, link people to care. Those people were linked to a very competent workforce, and then they were going to reevaluate, and that lets them help to improve public health. So I show you that video because that's kind of the culmination of everything that, I'm not going to say that's the be-all, end-all of global health, because it's not, but when people think about careers in global health, they often, the first thing they talk to me about is like Doctors Without Borders, mission trips, going and providing care. The 90+% of the work, the jobs in global health, aren't doing this. Okay, they're working in programs like that. They're helping to improve health of populations. Because the truth is, you, as a highly skilled worker, they want you to train others. They want you to come and influence to impact the population of a whole bunch of people, not just one person in a patient room, not just one person in a tent in a rural community, right? They want you to be a part of a program to help develop something that is bigger, right? And so the vast majority of work in global health is in fact in public health. Any questions about that before we kind of finish with the last activity? Any comments? What do you guys think? Do you agree, disagree, comments, frustrations? Finish line is near. Dinner is close. Okay. Well, let's talk about this case. So we're back in GHICC, and something starts to happen. A bunch of Fernando's neighbors are starting to become stricken with an acute, severe diarrheal disease. They're profoundly dehydrated to the point of obtundation. So they can't even stand up. They're so fatigued and so dehydrated, can't even stand up. They need to be promptly referred to the regional hospital for treatment, for hydration. And word from the relatives that returned from there is that they've been diagnosed with cholera, but it hasn't been confirmed. So they're coming back to Fernando's community. They're saying, hey, we hear it's cholera. So word's starting to get around that the water is poisoned. So the clinic facilities are being, you have a clinic there, and those facilities are being swarmed with villagers that are worried about getting sick. There's a factory upstream that's run by an international organization. So the local health authorities are concerned about water contamination from that factory, so they start to alert the local health authorities who then bump it up to the federal government, who involve the Pan American Health Organization. Pan American Health Organization sends a representative from the main office to the village to help investigate the illness. She recommends a quarantine of all the people who work in the factory, and that until more is known, that people from the village not travel. So I'm going to give each of you guys a question to answer about this, and you can use your smart devices to look it up. No? You're going to get the extra two. Because it's kind of there. So these are about
Just makes everything fits perfectly. Find them.
That's what makes
Because I was going to say, I was sure
more disability.
You were sort of saying, well, we'll just jump on Slack.
You don't realize how much you need there.
Take a couple things, but you gotta take so the slide that I made, I'm not very technically savvy. Text box, so that was is brutal. I mean, it's just like,
It's just say what you
flat, no.
It's
just thumb
Army style.
Or impact thousands of people across the globe to indicate where
Yeah, sure. So yes, you'll water. This is not
It's a requirement for our truck. Because that means that it counts to you guys, so you get some. Someone get it, someone. That's one.
Yeah, actually, we're as far as but that's okay. That's good. But
CDC issues
Yes.
I mean, that's
syllabus that they're going to be broken up into groups.
Give it about one more minute, guys.
there's an average of how much you're getting like purified water, they have that going to I think there are actually a lot of they said with Syria, it's like don't even agree that Syria is just people are actually not all like yeah, but that might take a while.
All right, guys, let's come together. So let's hear from you guys first. Read us your question, and then tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are.
Okay, so it says, does this event fit the definition of an outbreak, and what are the possible explanations if it does fit the definition? So the definition we found is a sudden rise in the incidence of usually something negative. So this death happens suddenly because of a bunch of people are afflicted, and it's something negative, it's a disease.
Mm-hmm.
And so for that, it does fit. And possible explanations, I guess, because they were trying to classify it as cholera, so they're trying to at least find out what the root cause of like the negative change was.
Yeah, so that's a great definition of an outbreak. An outbreak is, as you mentioned, it's a change or increase in the number of cases of something beyond what would be expected for that season in that community at that time, right? So if you see a flu outbreak in the middle of summer, we start to say, is it an outbreak or is it just a blip on the radar, right? Good. And so you said one of the things that can confound whether it's an outbreak. You were talking about that? You mentioned like one of the things that can confound whether it was an outbreak or not. Was it maybe they were looking, you said that maybe people were coming back and saying it was cholera. It was sort of skewing things, right?
Find a root cause of it.
So what happens in a community when someone says, hey, everybody's getting sick? So they start going to get seen, right? So sometimes you can pick things up that are not actually an outbreak because more people are entering the surveillance system, right? Who never would have entered a surveillance system. So there can be that artifact, right? So you have to be able to tease out whether it's a true outbreak or whether it's something that's caused by just increased reporting, right? Good. What do you guys have?
So the question, who's in charge of policing public health?
So who's in charge of policing?
So Google didn't really help us out with that. So we found a specific example, the quarantine, the police's quarantine.
Okay.
And so when we looked at that, if a quarantinable disease is suspected, then the CDC issues a federal isolation or quarantine order, and it's enforced at multiple levels: federal, state, local, and tribal. And not only that, not only the public health authorities at those levels, but also local law enforcement can assist as well. So it's like a multifocal plan that even starts with the president at times during an executive order that manages the policing.
Yeah, I agree with you. So the first level of policing of public health is individuals, right? Wash your hands, cover your mouth when you just sneeze, stay home when you're sick, don't expose everybody to your effluent, right? All those sort of things that are at the individual level. Then community level, health system level, national level, international level. One of the things, and Dr. Fingerhut probably remembers this. When we used to teach this course in the large group, we used to have a lady who worked with PAHO come, and she would talk a little bit about the public health system. In the United States, our hospital records, our culture data, or let's say I send a blood culture as a clinician, or I send a urine culture. Those culture data are audited regularly, and they are funneled to our local health district, then to the state, then to the CDC, and then to the WHO. And there are certain reportable diseases that we're always being screened for, right? So there's actually, you're all, as health workers, you're all part of the system of public health reporting. So kind of the accountability goes from individual level all the way up through the system. And policing it, as you said, when there's an outbreak of cholera in Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe's not able to handle it, that's a big problem, right? When there was an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, the WHO got a lot of flack because they didn't do a good job. They didn't mobilize resources. It was the United States military that ended up mobilizing resources. And military mobilizes quickly, but when you want to talk about a blunt object to fix a very specific problem, that's probably not the best group of folks to try to manage that. But WHO really fell through there. They got a lot of critique about that. So there is responsibility on international systems as well as on individuals. Right? So that's a good point. What about you guys?
We had how would the average person react to being quarantined? Felt like it was a fairly simple answer. Most people don't want to be quarantined. If you've got a disease that is really debilitating and you have to go live in essentially what's a prison, and you expect you might die there away from your friends, family, and home. I mean, we wouldn't like that. We wouldn't want that. So you're trying to convince a bunch of people to act against their personal interest, and most people don't want to act against their personal interest. So you've got to use force to make them act against their personal interest for the better of society.
That's great. It kind of brings us to your point, your question, guys.
Which is what human rights issues does quarantine raise? And exactly sort of what you're saying, you're basically presenting people in a cage with a disease that has the potential to kill them. And so that raises the human rights issue of are you basically just sentencing a group of people to die if you don't get in there and mobilize? And we sort of made the argument that if you do have an organization that's getting in there and it's actually making an effective quarantine, where within the quarantine they keep the people from who are actually infected separate from the community rather than just everybody, and are actively treating the community to prevent further outbreaks, then that can be a certain question, but it's also just instilling fear, potentially unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. So it's sort of, public health instruments can be broad and blunt, but there are better ways to do it. There are ways to quarantine people where it's not you lop off the hand to save the arm, right? Though, in some cases it comes out, any public health disaster movie usually makes it about that decision, right? We're just, imagine if you're here in Galveston and someone spills a bottle of Ebola and, they're just going to shut off the causeway. And, how are people going to react? They're not going to be extremely happy, right? But people in Texas City and on the mainland are going to be very happy, right? So, not to say that would never happen, but just to show you that public health instruments, they do have some granularity. There's the ability to focus quarantine, to be much more, dependent on symptoms, but sometimes you don't have the diagnostics, right? You have to go by symptoms. Just like those nuns during the tsetse fly sleeping sickness outbreak in the 1850s, you're sort of separating people based on blunt instruments, right? So, and there are some suspension of human rights that take place during quarantine so that you can protect the better interests of populations, right? Because it's not about you, it's about the population. So public health is a bit of a different way of thinking. And it sometimes comes into direct, I like to show the outbreak because it's like a direct conflict with how we train. In OT school and medical school and PA school, it's that client, that patient in front of you, that one person, whereas a public health person is really looking at a population and about a country or a community. So I hope what we've convinced you of through this session is that that we're all part of a public health system, that thinking from a public health perspective really is global health. You need to be able to, bring your skills and your talents as a clinician, but also be able to see the bigger pictures of determinants of health and of the systems and of how those diseases are in populations in order to be effective in global health. The things that we have learned throughout history have really improved health, right? If you look at the trends of life expectancy throughout history, we are living longer, right? Maybe we're living sicker in some cases, but we're living longer, right? We're not all dying in our infancy from cholera or from other infectious diseases. We're vaccinating people. We're doing better with infrastructure. We're doing better with prevention, especially the things that take people away in their most lively years, right? So we've seen decreased infant mortalities, higher life expectancies, and really changes in the global burden of disease, where it's not, in across the world, we're not seeing as many people die from infectious diseases. We're seeing the most common cause of death across the entire world is cardiovascular disease. So people are getting that privilege to live to the ripe old age where they die of a heart attack instead of dying at a young age from TB, right? And when we think about public health policy and public health as it stands now, it's really that cycle. It's the wheel. It's the three core functions, the 10 essential services that are public health and are global health. So we're going to be talking about health systems. I didn't go too much into it, even though you mentioned it here, and I wanted to. I was tempted to. But we're going to talk about health systems, human resources for health, and determinants of health in the next session. So for your next assignment, take a look at the literature. Think about your profession and think about a health system, right? How your profession is a part of the health system, and how does that pertain to you, right? So, and why does it matter to people who want to practice global health in your profession? Why is it important to understand the mechanics of a health system? Not necessarily a health care system, a health system, right? So we'll look into that a little bit more, but think about it in advance of the next session. Any questions? Awesome. Good job. Right.
That's great. So, did you say you're going to be ready?
I'll be here next time just to
Well, then how about I will, yeah, and then because you have all these stories that are, your background is like it's detective. Yeah. So I'll take it away and run it, and then I'll just say, and now Dr. Ashton, did you have that story?
Yes. That's fine. I'm happy to pepper it with anecdotes.
I'll try and memorize some of your stories.
No, it's fine. You're going to be awesome. I can't wait. Yep.
I have a question about the preceptorships that we have to go to.
Yes.
So I'm also in the physician dealer track, and I was.
You're in the what?
Physician dealer track.
Okay.
And that we have the AP. I was wondering how we could fit the credits that we need for.
So, have you met with Kayla yet? No. So I would definitely do that because what we will do is you're going to have to, since they have their required, you have to be here for 8 weeks. Right? You have to be here for 8 weeks. They haven't changed that.
Yeah.
Right? So you're going to have to do most all of your global health stuff in really years 3 and 4.
Okay.
Right? And there's some stuff that can cross-pollinate between those two, but it's totally doable.
How would I be able to contact you?
Or just email her, CASAT. And if you email me, I'll forward it along to her. If you want to sit with her and figure out how to plan, that's fine.
And I read that you also do you count like Fronteric or trips?
So they will count.
We are asking, Brad, are we tracking like volunteer hours right now?
Yeah, so on the discussion portion of the GHICC course, there's a community service volunteer area, and you just submit your hours and everything, what you did, a contact person for wherever you're helping out, and then I keeping track of the hours worked.
Did you go on the Frontera trip?
Yeah.
The recent one to Presidio? Yeah, so just put that in there. I'll just make sure it's in there.
So just, that's where it falls?
That's where it falls, yep.
Like if I were to do like complete, that would also fall there.
Exactly. Awesome. Hey, thanks. Good work.
Hey,
how are you?
Daniel.
Hey, Daniel.
I think I made sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious, have you ever read anything by Michel Foucault?
Yeah.
So, what did you think about the, did you read the plague state analogy, his sort of analysis of that?
No, I read most of the stuff I read was in grad school, and it was mostly about like mental institutions.
Okay, I don't remember if it was in the Madness one. It must not have been, but it's interesting. It's kind of just a deconstruction of the idea of the plague state whenever a plague or an outbreak hits, and he kind of talks about how in the past it's been used to benefit people in power. I mean, that's basically everything that he talks about. But you know, like the idea that okay, this person has this disease, and there's a certain special class of people who are able to identify the disease, but nobody else can.
Nobody else can do it. Their knowledge is power.
Yeah. So those special people, that priestly class or that doctor class, is they're almost a continuation of the same sort of tradition. They're the ones who are working for the government to kind of or the powers that be, the oppressors, to say, oh well, you have the disease, you have to go to quarantine, and oh by the way, Uncle Sam gets your house now, or something along those lines. And I don't know, I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts on that. I know it's a very broad, wide open question, but that's kind of something that I've been thinking about. I noticed there's a very sort of not super, but a little bit of an almost authoritarian bent to the way that we talk about a lot of things in medicine, where it's well, people shouldn't smoke. They don't need to smoke.
No,
we should encourage them to not smoke. And it's like, I get that. Yep. It's true. It's better for their health. And it's a personal decision as well. And, how do we balance off what people want and what they should have the right to choose? And maybe we're wrong. Maybe we're actually Nazis and we're forcing eugenics on everybody. We've been
guilty of that as a profession.
Yeah.
We're very complicit. I mean, I think the best example is, because Foucault would agree that especially the power class is self-interested. And it can be manipulated based on its self-interest. We certainly were. I mean, think about the reason we have a narcotic pandemic. It's because drug companies got us hey, patients are in pain. We got these highly addictive things, but it's going to work and it's going to be great and make a bunch of money. And they flew us out to conferences and they padded our houses and took us out to dinner. And then here we are in a pandemic, right? So I think actually like the Foucault ideas are extremely pertinent. I mean, we probably don't read about Foucault in this. We should be questioning those things, and it should make you uncomfortable that, I mean, even when certainly in health systems, that's one thing, in public health, in how we define the depressed, the schizophrenics, they get put into a category, and that lets you control them.
Well, that was actually one thing that was kind of sticking out to me with the data I'd taken, and also the class before was already a little bit familiar with it. But going over it again today, I was realizing, that's a very fuzzy category.
Totally.
Like you're just asking people, how does this thing affect you? What is your quality of life? I mean, that's like using the pain scale.
It is exactly right. And then all of a sudden, that is information that becomes power. It's a very, it's something that I, like, having read Foucault, I really struggle with because I'm intensely critical of our
you know, our health system and how we use knowledge with our patients. I mean, we defined the whole language that